open today's session. Perhaps we go into slightly more theatrical lighting. And I apologize for the heat in the studio. My name is Johannes Birringer. I coordinate the Brunel Performance Research Seminar Series, and we are meeting today for the 4th seminar, our first in 2016. And I will introduce our guests in a moment, so I welcome local audience and online audience. And I will say just one brief word of apology. There has been a cancellation, and I regret to inform you that the initial plan was to pair Taghreed Elsanhouri with Professor Anshu Mondal, who is here in the English department and is an expert in research on post-colonial literature. And his topic was going to be dealing with tolerance and dissent in current discussions on race and on politics, which I thought was interesting in terms of, pairing your project, which deals with a different conflict in the country where you were filming. But since you are a filmmaker and you are presenting part of your fieldwork and film work, the only way to make a good replacement of Anshu was to ask one of our speakers from the February seminar, looking ahead to the next session. We were going to have Piotr Cieplak paired with 2 other speakers. And so I asked Piotr whether he could step in, and he very kindly agreed. So what we're doing today is showing 2 films. Piotr will introduce his work. And the new topic, therefore, is, you see it on the screen. I'll bring it up. Memory cards, which will be our first contribution, and that will be followed by Taghreed Elsanhouri's Autopsy of a Partition. I have a second apology to make to our speakers and also to you. We are missing a large portion of our regular postgraduate audience, and I expect them to come within the next 10-15 minutes. They have a dance class today that ran over time. Because normally, all of these seats would be taken, yeah? So what, with your permission, I wanted to do now is to improvise for a few minutes and throw out a couple of images. And in the context of this year's series, which Broderick, you helped to initiate, and the topic of politics, decolonizing gestures, issues of democracy in a turbulent time of insecurity and precarity, where we see a lot of changes and challenges, I thought I'd just for a moment ask this question of how our democracy, our culture, our societies are dealing in Europe at the moment with perhaps the effect of political changes as well as the effects of migration. And Piotr, I found an image the other day on the German media, which I wanted to bring here today, partly because it personally affected me while I was away over the New Year's Eve, and so maybe I'll share this with you and ask whether we can maybe briefly discuss it before we go into the films, yeah? Just spending a little bit of time on pre-discussion before we show the films. Entrez, s'il vous plaît. Now, Anshu's title is somewhat mysterious, and I only know that in recent conversations with him, I know he's been interested in racism and in the way people articulate at the moment their fears or their anxieties about Islam. And in the larger European context, this fear and anxiety over the refugees is something that has been on my mind a lot. So photograph appeared just a couple of days ago in a German paper. Quo vadis Europa? Yeah, I don't know where this picture was taken, but it's a very strange overhead shot here of what looks like a road in the countryside with a flood of refugees stopped by policemen on horseback. But the incident that I want to briefly talk about is a different one. And I'd like to put it in a sort of a context of discussion about racism, if we can do that. And so the incident involves me being in the United States, and we celebrated New Year's Eve, and then on the next day I go to a cafe, and people who knew that I'm German come to me and say, Johannes, what happened in Cologne? I said, sorry? Because I had not watched the news. And what happened in Cologne, maybe you read the reports after New Year's Eve, maybe not, but I saw the other day an interesting photograph. This is during a volleyball game in Berlin, where the volleyball fans are hoisting a poster here. And in case you can't read it, I show it to you from a different protester. Polish protester in Berlin saying, protect your women, yeah? Not our democracy. So I want to briefly put this into context. The protect your women refers to the incident in Cologne, where apparently on New Year's Eve, when people go out to watch the fireworks, thousands and thousands of people were on the plaza in front of the cathedral. And then near midnight, groups of men apparently formed like kind of flash mobs, who then encircled women who were out on the plaza and molested them sexually, as well as, I think, stole some of their mobile phones and attacked them. And there have been now over, I think, 700 suits filed against unknown. And in the media later on, it was speculated that most of the men were of North African descent, Moroccan, North African, Arabic. So I'm wondering whether, if you follow these kind of news speculations, how we now look at violence against women, and also in the context of the refugee crisis, the quick assumption that was made that potentially this was to be expected, yeah? Aggression, violence, perhaps sexual violence against women by people who've fled their countries to come here. I'm open this up for anyone to discuss, because I think it's a very complex and sensitive issue, and partly it's of course media representation, partly it's the political discourse. And what is shown on this poster here is even more convoluted, because in terms of the democracy in Europe, I understand this photo to be Polish protests in Warsaw against the ruling party, the Law and Justice Party. And in Germany, as well as I think in the EU, there has been concerns about some of the more, I think, conservative and right-wing measures that the Polish government has taken, and also I think issues of censorship that concern the arts and free expression. But it intrigued me that the protester would hold up the sign saying, you concern yourselves with your own laws or with your own political, you know, enactments of justice and the law. Because of course what the women have been told, and I end here, is that there is very little likelihood that any of the men will be convicted. Because apparently even the sexual violation laws in Germany are such that you have to prove that there was an actual voluntary act of aggression, and that grabbing someone's ass or grabbing someone's breast is not considered actually sexual violence. And it's a very, very strange situation, because for the refugees, if they were refugees, they would of course then be liable to be deported, yeah, if they are sentenced. If they are not sentenced, then I don't know what.
Would they though? Is that the law? I think that was one of the points of contention, that there was a call for a change of law for that to be the case.
I'm under the understanding that if you enact a criminal trespass while you're waiting for asylum, that is not good for your wait for the asylum. So I just want to open it out for 5 minutes and then we move to your film. Have you been hearing about these incidents and have you formed an opinion, or would you be willing to discuss it with us? Because for me, the issue of violence is the one issue, yeah? And that there is no discussion about it. That, of course, cannot happen, yeah? I also don't understand why the police did not interfere. But now the political instrumentalization of the incident is such that the right-wing parties say, we told you, yeah, all these refugees cannot go well, yeah. We will have more to worry about and they should all be sent home. So that's what I wanted to bring as a brief introduction to the issue of race relations and politics. Any comments? I'll turn the lights up a bit.
Well, I mean, I think beyond this being a horrible incident to the individuals, which I don't think at any level should be discounted, another very upsetting result of this is providing this very fertile ground for the discourse of clash of civilizations within Europe, and this kind of chronicle of a death foretold that the right, both the kind of, if you like, politically legitimate right on the conservative side, but kind of within the mainstream, and also, what we've been seeing across Europe, the right-wing kind of dissent parties like Golden Dawn, like Pegida, and so on and so on. So, I mean, it's been completely hijacked into that discourse. This is to say, not to take away from the actual wrongness of the act of sexual harassment of women.
We know about what happened on New Year's Eve in several places as well, and also some of the towns now they're having to segregate their swimming pools. This is happening in Germany. Now there is a problem on this, because I almost wonder if it's. I'm not quite sure what the answer is. There needs to be some kind of maybe education on it. That's the only thing I can think of. Because I think it is. I mean, for the majority of people, it's not a problem, but just for a group of people, it is. And I mean, what do we do about that? I'm not quite sure, because it is definitely a problem.
Well, I think
and yet on the other hand, and the problem is that it makes it, worse for right-wing groups who then, well, it makes it better, really, I should say, for right-wing groups who then will actually take this on board and use it. And that's the last thing we want. That's the last thing anybody wants.
Yeah. I mean, I would ask what is the veracity of these incidents, and to what extent are these media narratives being promoted by a right-wing media to kind of fearmonger against refugees. But what is worrying is that the discussion is being polarized. And also, what is equally worrying is that one no longer knows what is the fringe and what is the mainstream view is. I think what is scary is the right-wing fringe.
I mean, I think you're right. I think the media is extremely powerful in all this, and they don't do any favours. Not certainly to migrants.
The spectrum of media representation, of course, is we have left and right media. So the left media, of course, say by no means should we now blame refugees. Yeah? By no means must we blame Muslims. Yeah?
But they found themselves in a little bit of a pickle, especially the kind of mainstream left-wing media. Well, I'm not sure what I would call the Guardian left-wing actually, but as perceived, because what you say on the one hand, and on the other hand, I mean, I have no knowledge that would serve to disapprove the claims of the abused women. So that was pitted against the idea of sexual harassment in public. So it was a bit of a pickle for them.
But I don't think it's about it's not so much that whether the women who have reported sexual harassment, their claims are true or false, but rather about who the perpetrators are, and you know, and what has motivated this, and who has organized it, and all of these questions remain unanswered.
And you know what, even if every single perpetrator of that particular incident was of North African descent, as been reported, there is then this tricky thing, you know, do you take the criminal actions of the few and then are able to then transfer it onto the entire group, which in itself as a group is vulnerable. There's this kind of, why would you homogenize everyone either as good or bad, or as sexist or not sexist? I think we do that with very few other groups in society, but yet it seems to be this need to essentially make up your mind about what you think about the migrant crisis. Are you for or are you against? And there isn't any space left for nuance, or very little, especially in the mainstream media, and also for divorcing the actions of individuals from the actions of a group.
Well, maybe we can come back to this at the very end, but Piotr, it's a great pleasure to have you here stepping in for Anshu. So Piotr Cieplak, our first speaker, is a lecturer in documentary practice here at Brunel, so in, I guess, the screen media film department, yeah? And I noticed when you gave presentations before that your field work, or some of your work, has been away from here, and you work in Africa, and you have made a film, or you have dealt with the crisis after the genocide in Rwanda. And I don't want to speak too much now as introduction, but let you perhaps briefly introduce Memory Cards, the film that you brought with you, and maybe we'll sit in the audience and watch. And then after Memory Cards, we follow up with Taghreed Elsanhouri's project on the partition in Sudan. So both films take us to some extent into Africa, although I think in Piotr's case, I noticed from glancing at it that, and this should interest all of you working in performance and media, the question of self-reflection on the making of the film, and of also Western perceptions of Africa, or Africa represented in media. Yeah? So please welcome Piotr Cieplak.
Thank you very much, Johannes. I won't speak for very long. But yeah, you're absolutely right. Most of my work centers around Africa, and a lot of it's around Rwanda and the representation, mostly through images, but not only of, and the mediation of the memory of the genocide and its aftermath, both in the country and externally, and the different ways in which that inscribes itself into wider discussions of the images, arguably unique, malleable function in engaging with death and memory. This is not a film about Rwanda, even though most of it was shot in Rwanda. So just to give you a little bit of a context, this is the second film in a triptych of short films, the first one questions the possibility of external mediation of genocide through photography. This one problematizes the issue of external gaze and issues around appropriation and reduction through this appropriation of memory and experience. The last part, which I will hopefully complete this summer, will be about images that predate the Rwandan genocide, so personal portraits of victims, but also perpetrators, and the way in which they're connected to commemoration and creation of memory, both personal and collective, both personal and political, in the country. But just to give you a few words of introduction about the film, in a very basic terms, it tells the story of a writer who goes missing during a trip to Rwanda and Zanzibar, and the only record of the journey that she undertook survives in the footage she captured on a small camera and sent to her friends and lover Tome. And after years of obsessively trying to decipher the meaning of these images, he enlists the help of two other characters, of Pierre, the woman's companion on the trip, and Liz, a TV producer who is considering turning the story of the disappearance into a blockbuster. So the film explores the theme of memory and loss, and is particularly concerned with the way images and their meaning can depend as much on the beholder as they do on the person who captured them. It also addresses the interaction between memory and raw digital image aesthetics, low quality aesthetics essentially, and how this interaction can influence the notion of authenticity of the non-professional. It's formally indebted to the essay film, I suppose, and sort of explores the idea of reclaimed found footage, in this case reclaimed fake found footage and personal archive. And by that it also probes the boundary, what I'd like to think, between documentary and fiction. So these are real-life images of Rwanda and Zanzibar and a real-life journey that was undertaken, but narrated by fictional characters who narrate the journey of another fictional character. My slight hope here, I think this is a kind of film that very much does what it criticizes, and I wanted it to do that. But I hope that it challenges to a certain extent and subverts some of the cliches and stereotypes present in how Africa appears to Westerners, although the kind of Africa-West dichotomy is not exactly one that I subscribe to either, but for the sake of clarity. Especially to those who claim to know the continent very well, so like the missing writer at the center of the film. There is this kind of bizarre thing, especially with people who worked there for a long time, that they share some kind of knowledge which is not exactly local, not exactly, but also not exactly learned, not exactly acquired. This kind of journalists very often have that. I don't know, I'm sure Will knows what I'm talking about. So this is what's at the center of the film. It also questions why and how Africa, pretty much in most mainstream narratives, fiction narratives, but also documentaries, essentially ends up becoming a backdrop for a Western story, which is also what happens in this film. But also, why the filmmaker points the camera and where and for what reasons. So I think we're going to leave it there.
It's a premiere also.
No, it isn't.
No.
No, sorry. It's been to quite a few festivals.
Oh, it has been
so,
already.
yes.
Okay. But you have not seen
It's a Brunel premiere.
It's a Brunel. Thank you very much. If you allow for questions later on, yeah, so we'll ask at the moment for our second guest to come forward. Sorry about that. Taghreed Elsanhouri is now a PhD student with us. She joined us not too long ago and is being advised by Maria Castrinou from anthropology and the field of ethnographic studies, and also by myself here in theater. And it's a great honor to invite you to show your film, because when she came to us to ask whether she could complete her PhD, the film was done, but the writing was also in its final stages, and you wanted to reflect on the process. And maybe rather than me now talking about what that implies, yeah, why don't you tell us your idea, namely when she approached me for the presentation, we initially thought it could be an installation. You wanted to break up the film into a video installation, and that may take some more time, so you're not quite there yet, but may I ask why you are interested in breaking up the film?
Well, that's part of the presentation.
The presentation, so I'll pass on to you. Yeah, please welcome Taghreed Elsanhouri.
Thank you. Well, I want to thank Johannes and Brunel actually for giving a home to my PhD, because it became something of a refugee project. It was an intellectual trauma of sorts that made it homeless, and I really do feel at home here intellectually and creatively. So thank you very much. I'm very grateful for having a home for the work. The film I'm going to show is also, like yours, about footage. It's a film made that is a film that is also not quite a film. It is still footage. It's called Sudan in Two. As I will explain, Autopsy of a Partition is really a form of inquiry for me. But so I'm going to share some reflections and insights about the process of making a documentary film in the lead up to the 2011 self-determination referendum on South Sudanese independence. At first, I shall outline the background to the research. I shall then explain why I use the term autopsy of a partition as metaphor for returning to interrogate from both a creative and scholarly perspective the film, as well as the unused footage from the process of making it. I shall then screen a short film called Sudan in Two. Now the film, my footage is rather rambling. I have 60 hours of footage. The film that is my thesis film is called Our Beloved Sudan, and that is a 71 minutes film that has been made and has had its little festival circuit, and so it's had its little life. But I'm now going back to that material and thinking about the material as process of inquiry, as process of ethnographic research. So in my approach to filming the countdown to the self-determination referendum, I was interested in exploring how the Sudanese were talking about unity and secession, and what this tells us about their articulations of nationhood. Although in Sudan there was ambivalence and soul-searching about partition, in the Western media the secession of South Sudan was represented as a straightforward liberation of black African Christians from the shackles of northern Muslim Arab oppression and exploitation. Notably, secession of South Sudan was being endorsed by Hollywood celebrities like George Clooney and influential American lobby groups who embraced and promoted dichotomized representations. by focusing on the internal dynamics, I sought to problematize what lies beneath these instrumentalizing representations of Sudan and the Sudanese. In addition to developing a narrative for a feature-length documentary film, Our Beloved Sudan, I was filming eclectically and trying to capture as much as I could of the countdown months through the vantage points of people from a diversity of Sudanese registers. I'm repeating myself here, so I amassed over 60 hours of footage. I was thinking at the time that this is such an important moment in the history of the country that I must leave some record of it. The archive, the archive of the future, I was sure would be populated with plenty of press conferences and official speeches and demonstrations, but I was interested in capturing the Sudanese as agents of their own historical process. 3 years on, so the film was made in 2012, Our Beloved Sudan, and of course the footage is there in my hard drive. So 3 years on, and already it is insightful to return to the material from a historical perspective. And what has been really interesting in this process of returning to the material is that this little film was commissioned for a project at Brunel University called Lines of Control, which was a huge exhibition involving many artists, many very established artists actually, who were all talking about partition. And the lines of control refers to the India-Pakistan partition. So scholar and filmmaker Hamad Nassar invited the participants in this exhibition to think of partition as a productive space. And I found that incredibly interesting, because up to that point, for me, partition was a sort of lament or a nostalgic looking back, or of course for South Sudanese who were, for those in South Sudan who were pro-secession, it was a triumphant fulfillment of a dream. But thinking of it as a productive space kind of, I think, made possible many analytical and creative possibilities. So I use the term autopsy as metaphor for reapproaching my 3-year-old footage at both a creative level as well as historically and analytically. First, at the creative level, I argue that although the documentary filmmaking process is dialogical and open, the documentary form, the grammar or rubrics of cutting a film is monologic, conforming to a narrative structure and a dramatic tension or plot that has to be contrived, a beginning, a middle, an end, a genre, for a mode of documentary address, whether that is observational or reflexive or and so on. So I use the term autopsy of a partition as analytical tool for rethinking the documentary form. What would be the creative possibilities in breaking up the form of the film, Our Beloved Sudan, and reclaiming footage and narrative threads that did not make it into the final cut film, so as to create new juxtapositions and new experiences for the audience. From these questions and reflections emerged the idea of creating a new work, a video installation, which would be an iteration of the form as well as a new engagement and commentary on the post-secession Sudans. So that's a big project, the autopsy, the installation. Secondly, when approaching the footage as historical materials, the autopsy asks us to consider the overwhelming South Sudanese vote for secession as visceral response to a historical legacy of domination and mistrust. I argue that on closer examination, these video documentations of everyday life and moments penetrate beneath the visceral response to offer a fuller understanding of the articulations of Sudanese nationhoods in the lead up to partition. The short film Sudan in Two juxtaposes the footage of testimonies from two different communities, both reflecting on the impact of partition on their way of life. My underlying question in the work is, what are the conceptual frameworks and metaphors that can help us to understand how Sudanese nationhood was articulated and the extent to which the act of voting in the self-determination referendum can be read as a confirmation or refutation of united nationhood. And the film is quite short, it's just 10 minutes.
Wonderful. So, I guess I press Apple F and it should start. So,
Yes.
do you want to have a seat again in the audience?
Yes.
And we'll be watching the film, and then it's open debate, yeah?
We have 2,000 kilometers. These are not desert frontiers like the frontier with Egypt, except on the Nile. But these are living frontiers. People are there. They're not even there as neighbors. A few millions are there. They go into each other area for seasons.
لسه ما ترسم الحدود لسه ترسم الحدود هم بيقولوا لكن لسه ما عرفنا واقع وين.
فأم جلالة دي يمكن تكون في الجنوب ولا
لا ده ما في الشمال.
والحتة البعادة شنو؟
الحتة اللي بعدها الكويك.
الكويك دي مؤكد جنوب ما؟
لا والدكونة مؤكد جنوب. والدكونة.
الكويك دي ممكن تكون شمال؟
والله يعني الكويك دي بين الأمرين. يعني احنا بين كويك وأم جلالة كده.
علينا التجارة بتاعتنا الثروة، ولا عندنا دكاكين ولا عندنا شركات ولا عندنا عربات ولا ناس متعلمين. والجنوب بنمشي له بيجبرنا المرعى بتاع الثروة. وهسه هنا نمشي يعني نخش الجنوب. العرب ديل كلهم مشوا الجنوب بثروتهم، ولا احسن يكونوا في الشمال؟
انت رأيك شنو؟
انا رأيي الشمال. والسودان ذاتها هي هو الشمال، لكن الجنوب عندهم حاجة يقصدوها. قاصدين عندهم حاجة يقصدوها، قاصدين يبقوا حكومة براهم وقاعدين يكونوا دولة براهم. كن يلقوها ولا ما يلقوها؟
لا شمال بلا جنوب، لا شمال بلا جنوب، لا جنوب بلا شمال، لا جنوب بلا شمال. بس نكون في السودان مش
الدولة بتقبل السودان يكون انفصال، يكون حكومتين؟ ما ممكن.
ما في اتفاقية السلام.
هاي كان
اتفاقية السلام بتديهم الحق انه يصوتوا إرادة الشعب. يا وحدة يا انفصال.
دي في الاتفاقية بتاعت نفاشة.
أيوه
موقعين له.
أيوه. ازيك يا حجة؟ السلام عليكم. جيتوا من وين؟
جاي من الخرطوم.
الخرطوم. وين في الخرطوم؟
ساكنين جبرونة.
جبرونة، من جبرونة. وماشيين وين؟
عايشين بور.
بور. مشيتي قبل أول مرة تزوري بور ولا؟
أول مرة.
اتولدتي في الخرطوم؟
اتولدت في الجزيرة.
إني في الجزيرة يا أخي. فرحانة إنك راجعة؟
فرحانة أشوف بلدي ذاته. داير أشوف بلدي.
ما أعرف.
أنت من وين؟
أنا من هنا.
ساكنة في
من الخرطوم لكن كنت في بريطانيا.
أيوة قايلاك خواجية حسي. من العرب مش؟ كويس ناس كلهم واحد. سب نمشي ونجي ونمشي وانتوا كمان تمشوا وتجوا معانا.
إن شاء الله.
إن
شاء الله كلنا نعيش في أمان.
إن شاء الله.
And how are you feeling at the moment? Are you excited?
I'm feeling fresh because there is a transport for our people easily to reach the area in order to settle. There is no settlement here. Are you settling now?
I'm settled here. But you don't feel at home here?
I feel at home, but let us go another home also. There is a man home. My mother tongue is there, is it? I'm not against somebody. I'm feeling home, but I'm going to make something to cultivate, to work, to do something for my children. Now I'm jobless. Have you any job?
I have.
What kind of your job? See how dirty we are and we are educated. Why?
Sorry, I didn't get it.
We are now dirty and we are educated. Why?
You are educated?
And I have no job. Why? Am I having no power to work or qualifications? I'm talking now English and Arabic both. Why don't I have a work? Huh? How do you feel? How do you feel yourself? How do you feel you yourself?
في رأيك هل نحن قصرنا في حاجة؟ هل في حاجة كان نحن ممكن نعملها عشان الجنوبيين ما يكونوا عايزين الانفصال؟
والله ما قصرتوا. شمال ما قصرت في شيء، لكن في زمن السلف حقيقة هم مظلومين. وظلمونهم شنو؟ الجهل، ما متعلمين. الساعة دي ظلمنا نفسنا. شمالين بلومونا بشيء؟ كان خشينا المدارس ما الليلة كلنا نكونوا وزراء ونكونوا قضايا ومحامية.
الزمن ده زمن تمرد دول المشاكل دي كملت السعية. زمان الجنوبيين ما نجوا تلقاهم قاعدين معنا زي قاعدين في العناقرب دي. الجنوبي ما يمسكوه مثلا هم هناك بيعرسوا بالبقر. ما أنا الواحد يجي يعرس بقرة بالبقر وهم يجوا يدوروا يشاكلوا ويقبضوا فيهن. هنا قاعدين بنضوا البقرة للجنوب نحلوا تب الغنماء السوق تديها ليه.
أولادهم بيجوا معانا هنا.
أولادهم بيجوا بيقعدوا معانا سارحين لنا قاعدين زي قاعدين. ناس طيبين هنا نمشي لهم هناك في بيوتهم هناك.
ده ذاتهم حبوباتهم جنوبيين. شفتوا هسه دايره هنا كلنا حباتنا جنوبيين حبوباتنا.
أنت حبوبتك جنوبية؟
أيوة.
من وين؟ من ملكال ولا وين؟
من ملكال.
هم الجنوبيين يعني ليه ليه في مرارة شديدة بينهم وبين العرب؟ يعني
ما بدوروا العرب.
ليه؟
ما العرب ديل الجنوبيين ديل ما مضغوطين، وهسي جاتهم معلومة جديدة والامريكان دي قوتهم وناس مطالبين ديون دايرين الانفصال ده على حسب يحلوا ديون
يعيشوا حرين.
منو اللي عنده ديون؟
هم ذات مطالبين ديونهم من زمن قرن حي. شغالين في اموال كده في طابعات كده في الجنوب في جوبا تطبع قروش. الاسلحه دي جابوها من من ملكان ولا جابوها من الامريكان؟
هم كان الحرب ده بيشيلوا من الدول.
ما من الدول. وبعدين كانوا مضغوطين وسع لقوا شويه يعني هوا هاتاني بيقبلوا تملكوهم برضه الشماليين ما بيقبلوا دايرين الانفصال هم.
وانت رأيك شنو؟
انا رايي خوالي ما ظلموا.
وحسي انت تزوجت شمالية ولا جنوبية؟
انا تزوجت شماليه. دي من دول مع عيالي ديل.
ده أسرتي دي
دي
كلها.
صورتي دي مرض ولدي
ده كل البيت ده.
If I beg you now to marry one of our people, will you accept it?
لا
ما يمكن.
حتى انه حبوبتك جنوبية؟
ما بتدي.
ما يمكن.
نحن ما بندوهم الا نحن بنتزوج منهم وبنتزوج منهم وبنسلم منهم ويكونوا معانا.
لكن ما بندهم.
لكن نحن اسرتنا ما بنديها لهم هم غالي هم لا.
ليه لكن؟
ما وضعهم هم ما معانا ما كويس.
ما ناس ما مسلمين.
ما مسلمين.
يدوم كيف؟
ده السبب الوحيد؟
أيوة.
وإذا ما في جنوبيين مسلمين؟
ما في جنوب.
في الدين كمسلمين.
يعني قليل.
طيب واحد مسلم جاء.
ما بندي.
ما بندي.
Can you go?
Thank you so much also for the introductions that both of you gave. I have part of your thesis here with me because I'm studying it. And maybe as an opening question, you have a very intriguing chapter on a workshop that you were doing while you were filming involving Boal's theater technique. And you said there were certain complications. And you were very much, I think, introducing this notion of a dialogic process. Would you mind just saying a few things about that? And looking at the way this gentleman was pointing at you and asking, it's intriguing when the speaker actually goes so close into the camera and asks you also about your role, as the person behind the camera. So maybe you can both briefly talk about this question of your personal situatedness in the film. But this Boal, can you say something about that?
Yes. Well, Boal devised a form of theatre where the audience and the performance interact, and where the audience have the right to interact, to intervene in the performance and change its
Change the
course,
script or
the
change the situation.
change the situation
As a political empowerment.
As a political empowerment, and I think that is a key point that that in the Western representations of the Sudanese are always a spectacle. They are there to be. They are brought to us in the Western Academy or the Western Museum to be seen, but they never speak. And even in news broadcasts, when we had the Darfur crisis, nobody actually bothered to even get vox pops from the people in the camps, in the refugee camps, in the IDP camps, internally displaced people's camps. So I felt the Sudanese, as a British person of Sudanese origin living in the UK most of my life, it was a very disempowering experience to not. I thought, do the Sudanese people actually think about their problems? Do they actually have a position on the issues that concern them? and it was very distressing. It was a visceral. My filmmaking, in a way, was a visceral response to a situation that I was encountering and that I still encounter. It's a very persistent representation here in the West. This idea of bringing a people either as an abject image or as a romanticized image. Both are equally offensive in my view.
And both of you, in a sense, maybe through the choice of the images or through the voiceover, are commenting on the role of children in the image. Maybe let's move to Piotr for a moment. Your film actually comments, the producer comments on, oh, that's cute, can they be a bit more lively? Yeah? And this is very cynical and interesting to me. But tell us about your subject position in the making.
The film subject, or
your own as a maker.
Okay. Well, that was parts of the thing. I've spent quite a lot of time writing about representations of Africa and Rwanda, and mostly being very unkind about them. And then there's an interesting thing that happens when you go there and you've got a camera, and you sort of do a bit of a self-examination as to where you are going to put it. And there are certain, I think, I'm not going to say subconscious, but there are certain images I think were fed from very, very early on in the Western media that then made you attracted to a particular kinds of images. There was an excellent article in the Granto about 4 or 5 years ago about how to write about Africa, in which the images of the dirt roads and people existing under horrible conditions but indignity and all the words that get bandied about, but as you say, without actually, there doesn't seem to be enough space, at least in the mainstream, for any kind of exploration of the actual voices, and mine film doesn't do that either.
You have seen both now, and you heard our guests introduce the films. Please pose your own questions and comments and help them to see, through your reception, how their films are affected.
I just, if you don't mind, just wanted quickly to finish my point about Boal.
Okay.
Which is that, it's a workshop that was not realized due to censorship, but I was going to situate the film in a school and have, and I was really wanting to address silence, that voices that we had a lot of, there were lots of platitudes in the lead up to the self-determination vote, promoting a united Sudan, but these were government platitudes.
No north without the south, no south without the north.
So I really wanted to see what lay beneath these platitudes, and I wanted it from the point of view of mostly people who will vote, and those were the Southern Sudanese people. And so the idea was to hold these workshops to create sketches where the students would intervene, and I have two forum play sketches that are part of the research, but the project was interrupted before sufficient filming took place to create a film.
Thank you for expounding on that. Good. So, to the floor, questions and comments. And mind you, when you first approached me, Sudanese partition, I knew so little about it because I had not followed it, and so I had to do some background reading and realizing, how little I knew. Yes, Khalid.
Yeah. First, I don't want to sort of conflate everything into one. It's kind of, they were both kind of very impactful, and I want to be mindful not to just put it all into one thing. So from what I experienced, Piotr, yep. I really appreciated that from a viewer's perspective, that you sort of took care of all the assumptions. You separated each assumption so that there, I wasn't experiencing, this is going to be a trap or some kind of objectification or representation. You kind of sort of took care of that in terms of my mind, so I could actually sit and actually enjoy and listen as the story sort of unfolds from that sort of the writer's perspective. And from that point of view, I felt like I was able to actually imagine where was this woman, and looking at these lenses almost vicariously through the protagonist, or if you will. So I really appreciated that, even though there was obviously explicit language and a point of view, or there was strong intentions from your behalf, from a producer or a writer, but I still felt that you weren't just holding on to having a sort of expectation of what you wanted the viewer to experience, but you left something that was open-ended where there's so much room for interpretation. So I really appreciated that. I felt that was strong.
Thank you.
For the second film, what I felt was really compelling was actually you, in a sense that that having real interaction, I guess from an anthropological perspective, I can't really assume what it would be like to be in that. I don't know the culture. There's a lot that I don't know, but having your voice and seeing how they react to you, and obviously you're here now, then for me, from an imaginative perspective, it's really quite exciting, because then I get to see, okay, how do they react or respond to you as a human being, maybe on a soul level. That was, I felt really strong, because the footage, as you mentioned earlier, the sort of juxtapositions, really I kind of relaxed and was seeing things from a very human curiosity, because nothing was fixed. It's just all this kind of curiosity, and obviously there are a lot of emotions within the interaction, even on a very subtle level, that only kind of hint at something, something that's looming underneath, or all kinds of other factors that I felt was really quite strong. So I really appreciated actually just the juxtaposition where you, in a similar vein, that you didn't hold on to saying, hey, this is what I want the audience to see, but you yourself were curious. You didn't, and I could sense that as a viewer, that you, that almost like from your heart's perspective, that you connected with the situation, but you were open from your heart and your mind, so much so that it even allowed them to even then come and almost be intrusive on you, which was really wonderful. So
that's a beautiful response, and I mean, in a way, there was this one moment which I don't think you have in the film, but you have it here in the other film, where the woman in blue dress says, I knew there was something with your language, yeah? When you said you are based in the UK. And was there any prejudice towards you having come back to Sudan or having been abroad?
Well, again, in writing up the thesis, I talk about that position. I call it daughter returning. And daughters have a very special place in Sudanese society. They are, although women, traditionally live within certain constrictions and so on, daughters are particularly indulged, as long as they conform. and and so I think I was in that film. I was or throughout.
Daughter filmmaker, interesting
Yes,
role.
Yes,
Yeah.
but actually not just in the film, but throughout my field work, I was pushing the boundaries. I was pushing invisible lines because it is a divided society. But as a daughter returning, I can claim, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't realize there's a line here that I wasn't supposed to cross. And sometimes I was doing it with an understanding that there's a line, but I dare to cross it. But sometimes I actually do cross a line that I don't know is there, and I did manage to get into trouble some of the time.
So
But I think that is.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, please.
I just find the idea of not only revisiting the footage, but revisiting the footage that didn't quite make it to the other film absolutely fascinating. I thought it was brilliant, and especially the interaction with the man who challenges you directly. You don't see that very often. You don't see it held that long. Your camera doesn't fear awkwardness, which most people do, and that's very powerful. I thought it was fantastic. Sorry, go on.
No, just that man. That was actually a very scary moment because I didn't immediately read his anger. I didn't read that
And
he
the
was
bodyguard next to him.
Well, yes, I didn't read that they were cross until quite late on. But what made him really cross was when he asked me that question: would you marry a man from our people or something like that? And I replied to him, but of course I cut out my reply and put the reply of the nomadic Arab community. But I said to him, of course I would if I were in love with him, a banal reply.
Sure.
And that upset him deeply. It made him so cross, and that's when he said, now go.
I wanted to also ask, what made you, what was the decision, what was the thinking behind the inclusion of the essentially animal decay or partition, obviously, imagery, which has obviously got such a rich tradition, especially political filmmaking, in a metaphorical sense. What was?
Well, I apologize. It is a very graphic image, and I think it describes or it speaks to the feeling of that trauma at the time, which now we have some distance from. But for the Northern Sudanese, the partition was seen as some sort of an amputation. Right. They were talking about it in these physical terms, that it felt like a part of their body would be gone, a limb would be missing, and so in the first film I have a scene that is the slaying of the cow, or that is how I imagine the shoot, the slaying of the cow shoot, and it was and of course the slaying of an animal has religious connotations. It has ceremonial connotations, and so it runs as a theme in both of these films.
We might come back. Broderick.
So I wanted to ask Piotr about the role of beauty within this filmmaking and the binary, of course, between abject images of Africa versus the very, very beautiful images of Africa. So you kind of littered the film in some ways with images of great beauty throughout, and there was something about the materials that you're working with and the high definition and the clarity of the cameras now. It's almost as if you can't. How do you make a non-beautiful image? But there was something quite interesting within the playing of that, and I don't know if it's actually intentional, but I actually found
the slowing down.
Yeah.
No, I think that was a playback problem.
So this is very, very interesting, though, because I thought the fact that I suspected that it was a playback.
There are points. I think there are a few points where it is deliberately slowed down with the fly.
But I thought at times that playing with the idea that the lag and the glitch actually happens, the degrading of the image itself. So it's as if the collapsing of the gaze is.
Look, so the diegesis stops on the image of the child. Well, it should stop rather than it kept stopping of the. It slows down an image of the dead fish and then it stops on the image of the child next to a gun. That's the two times where that's broken.
But I guess the question was what, even though it wasn't intentional, is there something about the kind of breaking down of the materials that you're working with that could, in some ways, escape this binary between the beautiful and the abject within representations of Africa?
I'm not sure whether I would, but I have to think about it, whether a direct link between the kind of disturbing, because it's not a particularly continuous film, so it's continuous visually to a certain extent, but not in the traditional sense of cinema, especially documentary editing, where support some kind of argument. But the beauty versus abject thing is obviously a very very current but also very established debate, and I'm not sure I've got any answers about this. And at the moment I'm working on a paper comparing two photographers who worked in Rwanda in the aftermath of the genocide, immediate aftermath of the genocide. One of them, who's Gilbert, who took a number of very distressing images of rotting bodies and mutilated bodies. And even though a professional photographer, began to describe himself as a forensic photographer, or more akin to forensic photographer, in the Rwandan context, in the post-Rwandan context. And on the other hand, you could obviously make a number of assumptions. You can find beauty in these images too, in terms of their tonality and everything else. But on the other hand, you've got someone like Sebastião Salgado, who wasn't working in Rwanda itself, but he was working in the camps in what used to be Zaire, and it's now the Democratic Republic of Congo, and his images are incredibly beautiful. There's almost kind of pastoral scenes, and they very much worked at images who are sometimes painted by hand in the development process, and he very much argues that beauty is the only way in which he can access people's attention, and then the suffering and the beauty don't necessarily have to be divorced. Obviously, that becomes a problem at certain points when it's become fetishized. But I think, I haven't found an answer as to how to fit oneself between those two extremes which seem to dominate so much of the representations of Africa.
You want to comment on that?
Just a quick comment.
Yes.
What I think was interesting about how you navigated those kind of that field about the Western representation as a Western filmmaker is your reflexivity, which I think is very rare in films by non-Africans about Africa. That kind of, it's not, it's the reflexivity of the characters that you have put in the story.
But I think because there's never time, that's because I think if you go down the self-reflexive route, this is what the film becomes about. There's no way in which you can make it part of a film, unless we're talking about the kind of very standard, a journalist in a fiction film has a bit of a breakdown and is thinking whether what he's doing is truthful or what she's doing is truthful or right. But that's a different kind of reflexivity.
Yes.
But I think that it takes over the formal it has to take over the formal aspect of the film. Otherwise, it's very difficult to accommodate it.
You spoke of the video essay or the film essay as a particular, perhaps, form, and I think here we're looking also at the relations between documentary and ethnographic film, and I think in ethnographic film, at least in the last 30 years, you would have a very self-reflexive and I think careful approach to how you represent the field. I think, at least in those...
Well, acknowledge within the text.
Yeah, in the film text itself. Although, I'm not an expert in ethnographic film, but those that I have seen seem to be conscious of this, yeah? We have a question in the back.
Yeah, thanks. So I'd mainly got a question for Piotr, but I suppose it's possibly relevant to both of you. I should add a caveat that film is not what I do, so it's maybe a really stupid question. But I was very struck, especially by your footage of Butare of the street scene, of the sort of candid camera work.
Yeah.
Together with the story of the woman who's disappeared, and this keeper of a genocide memorial who says off camera that he wishes people wouldn't talk about the genocide anymore. So there's actually a sort of very sinister undercurrent, in a way, behind a lot of what shows up on the screen in your film. And I may, of course, be playing on a sort of insider knowledge of people who've been to Africa there, but it did make me think about the way that the watching that was going on wasn't just these white Western people watching Africa and making it a screen for their own story, but that somewhere like Rwanda is very much constituted out of different kinds of watching, which is mobilized for political purposes. And I wondered if that was part of what you were trying to do, because it came across very sort of, yeah, like this sort of really sort of disturbing thing which was going on behind the story you were trying to tell, at least for me.
I think there was an element of it, the way in which the idea of looking and recording, especially in the post-genocide reality, is in Rwanda is very particular. But I suppose what I was trying to get at is, which was based on a number of conversations with Rwandans, is the idea of reduction and the idea of mostly the Western eyes observing, but not so much observing in any kind of surveillance way, but observing for meaning. And then that's obviously very much combined with not completely ununderstandable kind of obsession with the genocide, because it is such an overwhelming thing, and it's also the reason why so many people are there, professionally or in the NGO sector, and so yes, it is reductive, but it is also, there is a certain understanding, I think, of why this reduction occurs. But what happens is I suppose the kind of number of texts that talk about it, the number of people who have something to say, and which is absolutely fine, but a lot of them don't really add anything and are not particularly representative. And it is, I think, but the ability to do that, I think, stands in stark contrast in a way, for instance, with how the voices of the survivors are silenced for various reasons, both in Rwanda and beyond. So maybe that came through there. I'm not sure if that answers the question.
Yeah, no, I mean, I guess so. I mean, it was just making me think, I suppose, obviously you're getting at that reduction, I completely take the point, but the way in which, I mean, in both of these cases, in a sense, there's not just a reduction happening from the outside, but there's also a self-presentation which is being policed by certain kinds of watching. I mean, especially, Rwanda's the case I happen to know, so I mean, that whole thing about the genocide isn't just a Western obsession, right? This is a totally state-sponsored obsession with genocide, which then has to be watched, this thing, and I imagine similar kind of things, when you're mentioning censorship in the case of Sudan, that there was also this other watching going on about what you were doing and what people were saying.
I mean, Emmanuel, the librarian, saying, "I don't want to speak about it anymore, and I wish you wouldn't." That was a very powerful moment.
So he wasn't a librarian. He was so Emmanuel was a real character. The character speaking in the film was a Rwandan filmmaker character who didn't speak. We don't hear Emmanuel speaking in the film. Although he's a very interesting case, because he sadly he died 2 years ago. He was one of the, I think, 6 survivors of the massacre in Murambi Hill, where I think about 50,000 people died, and him and another lady, I think called Justine, were looking after that place, and in a sense, a lot of the memorials in Rwanda are very professionalized, and it's a very kind of professional and curated type of memory, especially in Kigali, especially where the international tourists go. Murambi is very different, because it was left as it was, essentially a slightly unfinished technical school with the bodies of sort of semi-preserved in lime of the victims from there, who were thrown into pit latrines and preserved with lime. And there's an amazing Rwandan film called Keepers of Memory by Eric Kabera, which talks about the people who survived particular sites and yet are sort of tied to them by looking after them. And Emmanuel Muganzira, he does appear in so many films, and he appears in so many books. He became, and his scar, was very recognizable, and he turned it into he became one of the spokespeople, I suppose. Not so much in any political sense, but especially to Westerners. But he would show you around, and sort of it was very easy because of the ease and kind of routine, because it was very easy to forget almost that every time he does that, he must, in some whatever small way, relive that memory. Although obviously, traumatic memory and recollection are very complex and individualized concepts. So, it wasn't him.
And this whole question of the memory, your research on memory, and is such a fascinating topic. If you think about also Holocaust studies in Europe and in Israel. One of our MA students is not here. Louis has written in his essay on post-Civil War conflict in Lebanon, and how something is missing there, namely, and I don't know how you feel critically about the South African and Rwandan reconciliation process. How after genocide, the state or the political party decides on we need to have some form of reconciliation and then move forward. And how is that managed in different societies? It's a huge field of discussion. We have to come to a close. Helena, a brief comment from you, and then we'll wrap up. Please.
I've never been to Africa, so thank you for showing a beautiful film. Okay, I'll make it really short. I noticed the two films where yours is just voice over. So I'm not very well today, so my voice is a little weak. And where yours is more like an interview to the person in the film. So I wonder what made you list the choice for the documentary film.
So what motivated the choice of
the
way in which?
So, but like yours memory cards, there are a lot really beautiful images. Some of them almost look like a painting. So I really like it. For me, I feel like you deliberately have this blur image and camera shaking.
Yeah.
So I just wonder what made you choose that voice over, like Emmanuel, you must be met him face to face, but you didn't talk to him in the film.
Well, I suppose that the way in which the film was conceived, and one of the things I wanted to explore is the idea of a power over images, and the two ways in which you control images on screen are through the way they are put together through editing and then through the audio. So it was very much reaching back to a memory. So these voices from the present and the different presents, talking over what is the footage of the past, made the register of a voiceover, multiple voiceovers, just sort of in dialogue with each other, but not really seemed like the kind of intuitive way to.
The memory card makes us as artists seems to think more and more observed, and for me, you made the film very arty. It's like an artist instead of a journalist. Or yours is more like you interview them. It's a real life. You can see the interaction.
Do we ever see you on camera in the interviews, or
no? Because
no.
a lot of the time I'm filming.
You are behind the
so
camera.
I'm behind the camera. Although sometime I do have a cameraman with me as well who contributed.
But we hear your voice asking the questions.
But I think in this little film and in my bigger film, it's really about the quality of that engagement. So I am in the film, and I consider it a reflexive piece of work, because I am there. I let you know as a viewer that I'm there, and I'm letting you know my position in the work, how my position in the work impacts the interaction. But I think your point about voiceover or narration, it's a choice. I think it's a creative choice. It's sometimes a functional choice in a film, and I really like the way you used the idea of a narration where you dramatized it into these many voiced narration. Narration is traditionally seen as a kind of omniscient point of view, but I think many filmmakers are subverting that idea either by using a very subjective narration, or like in this case,
Fictional
a
characters,
fictional
yeah.
character.
Yeah.
But I think you're sure there's definitely a renaissance of, or reinvention of this, going away from the kind of voice of God expository, kind of very didactic lecture-like narration.
Yes.
That sort of just presents a proposition. Yeah, I think that's right.
But
The content.
the content.
The
Yes.
content.
Yes.
Well, this was rich and very provocative, and I think it was also the first time that we've had
Provocative, were we?
yeah, two filmmakers in this series. So I'm extremely grateful to Taghreed and Piotr, and also for you staying so long with us. Thank you very much indeed. So we'll wrap up here, and we'll meet again in February. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Very, very much enjoyed that.
Thank you. I really enjoyed your work too. It's very refreshing. I mean, for me to see a Western film.
Was taken, but it's a very strange overhead shot here of what looks like a road in the countryside with a flood of refugees stopped by policemen on horseback. But the incident that I want to briefly just talk about is a different one, and I'd like to put it in sort of a context of discussion about racism, if we can do that. And so the incident involves me being in the United States, and we celebrated New Year's Eve, and then on the next day I go to a cafe, and people who knew that I'm German come to me and say, "Johannes, what happened in Cologne?" I said, "Sorry?" Because I had not watched the news. And what happened in Cologne, maybe you read the reports after New Year's Eve, maybe not, but I saw the other day an interesting photograph. This is during a volleyball game in Berlin, where the volleyball fans are hoisting a poster here. And in case you can't read it, I show it to you from a different protester. Polish protester in Berlin saying, "Protect your women, yeah? Not our democracy." So I want to briefly put this into context. The "protect your women" refers to the incident in Cologne, where apparently on New Year's Eve, when people go out to watch the fireworks, thousands and thousands of people were on the plaza in front of the cathedral, and then near midnight, groups of men apparently formed like kind of flash mobs, who then encircled women who were out on the plaza and molested them sexually, as well as, I think, stole some of their mobile phones and attacked them. And there have been now over, I think, 700 suits filed against unknown. And in the media later on, it was speculated that most of the men were of North African descent, Moroccan, North African, Arabic. So I'm wondering whether, if you follow these kind of news speculations, how we now look at violence against women, and also in the context of the refugee crisis, the quick assumption that was made that potentially this was to be expected. Open today's session, perhaps we go into slightly more theatrical lighting, and I apologize for the heat in the studio. My name is Johannes Birringer. I coordinate the Brunel Performance Research Seminar Series, and we are meeting today for the 4th seminar, our first in 2016. And I will introduce our guests in a moment, so I welcome local audience and online audience. And I will say just one brief word of apology. There has been a cancellation, and I regret to inform you that the initial plan was to pair Taghreed Elsanhouri with Professor Anshu Mondal, who is here in the English department and is an expert in research on post-colonial literature. And his topic was going to be dealing with tolerance and dissent in current discussions on race and on politics, which I thought was interesting in terms of, pairing your project, which deals with a different conflict in the country where you were filming. But since you are a filmmaker and you are presenting part of your field work and film work, the only way to make a good replacement of Anshu was to ask one of our speakers from the February seminar, looking ahead to the next session. We were going to have Piotr Cieplak paired with 2 other speakers. And so I asked Piotr whether he could step in, and he very kindly agreed. So what we're doing today is showing 2 films. Piotr will introduce his work. And the new topic, therefore, is, you see it on the screen. I'll bring it up. Memory cards, which will be our first contribution, and that will be followed by Taghreed Elsanhouri's Autopsy of a Partition. I have a second apology to make to our speakers and also to you. We are missing a large portion of our regular postgraduate audience, and I expect them to come within the next 10-15 minutes. Aggression, violence, perhaps sexual violence against women by people who've fled their countries to come here. I'm open this up for anyone to discuss, because I think it's a very complex and sensitive issue, and partly it's, of course, media representation, partly it's the political discourse. And what is shown on this poster here is even more convoluted, because in terms of the democracy in Europe, I understand this photo to be Polish protests in Warsaw against the ruling party, the Law and Justice Party. And in Germany, as well as I think in the EU, there has been concerns about some of the more, conservative and right-wing measures that the Polish government has taken, and also, I think, issues of censorship that concern the arts and free expression. But it intrigued me that the protester would hold up the sign saying, you concern yourselves with your own laws or with your own political, enactments of justice and the law, because of course what the women have been told, and I end here, is that there is very little likelihood that any of the men will be convicted, because apparently even the sexual violation laws in Germany are such that you have to prove that there was an actual voluntary act of aggression, and that grabbing someone's ass or grabbing someone's breast is not considered actually sexual violence. And it's a very, very strange situation, because for the refugees, if they were refugees, they would of course then be liable to be deported, if they are sentenced. If they are not sentenced, then I don't know what.
Would they, though? Is that the law? I think that was one of the points of contention, that there was a call for a change of law for that to be the case.
I'm under the understanding that if you enact a criminal trespass while you're waiting for asylum, that is not good for your wait for the asylum. So I just want to open it out for 5 minutes, and then we move to your film. Have you been hearing about these incidents? They have a dance class today that ran over time, because normally, all of these seats would be taken, So what, with your permission, I wanted to do now is to improvise for a few minutes and throw out a couple of images. And in the context of this year's series, which Broderick, you helped to initiate, and the topic of politics, decolonizing gestures, issues of democracy in a turbulent time of insecurity and precarity, where we see a lot of changes and challenges. I thought I'd just for a moment ask this question of how our democracy, our culture, our societies are dealing in Europe at the moment with perhaps the effect of political changes as well as the effects of migration. And Piotr, I found an image the other day on the German media, which I wanted to bring here today, partly because it personally affected me while I was away over the New Year's Eve, and so maybe I'll share this with you and ask whether we can maybe briefly discuss it before we go into the films, yeah? Just spending a little bit of time on pre-discussion before we show the films. Entrez, s'il vous plaît. Now, Anshu's title is somewhat mysterious, and I only know that in recent conversations with him, I know he's been interested in racism and in the way people articulate at the moment their fears or their anxieties about Islam. And in the larger European context, this fear and anxiety over the refugees is something that has been on my mind a lot. So a photograph appeared just a couple of days ago in a German paper, Quo Vadis Europas, yeah? I don't know where this picture, have you formed an opinion, or would you be willing to discuss it with us? Because for me, the issue of violence is the one issue, yeah? And that there is no discussion about it. That, of course, cannot happen, yeah? I also don't understand why the police did not interfere. But now the political instrumentalization of the incident is such that the right-wing parties say, we told you, yeah, all these refugees cannot go well, yeah? We will have more to worry about and they should all be sent home. So that's what I wanted to bring as a brief introduction to the issue of race relations and politics. Any comments? I'll turn the lights up a bit.
Well, I mean, I think beyond this being a horrible incident to the individuals, which I don't think at any level should be discounted, another very upsetting result of this is providing this very fertile ground for the discourse of clash of civilizations within Europe, and this kind of chronicle of a death foretold that the right, both the kind of, if you like, politically legitimate right on the conservative side, but kind of within the mainstream, and also, what we've been seeing across Europe, the right-wing kind of dissent parties like Golden Dawn, like Pegida, and so on and so on. So, I mean, it's been completely hijacked into that discourse. This is to say not to take away from the actual wrongness of the act of sexual harassment of women.
We know about what happened on New Year's Eve in several places as well, and also some of the towns now they're having to segregate their swimming pools. This is happening in Germany. Now there is a problem on this, because I almost wonder if it's. I'm not quite sure what the answer is. There needs to be some kind of maybe education on it. That's the only thing I can think of. Because I think it is. I mean, for the majority of people, it's not a problem, but just for a group of people, it is. And I mean, what do we do about that? I'm not quite sure, because it is definitely a problem.
Well, I think